Okay, hello everybody. Hi Adoyo. I'm
Hey.
delighted to be here with my good friend and colleague.
hmm
I'm Eugenio Refini. I'm an associate professor of Italian studies at NYU,
hmm
and I'm really happy to be with my dearest friend Adoyo, whom actually I met in Pisa ages ago at this point.
Yes,
It's nice to be back with you, Adoyo.
I know. It's been, oh my gosh, I think it's been more than a decade, Eugenio,
I'm
since we
afraid it
first
is more
met.
than a decade.
More than a decade. Incredible. I'm Adoyo. I'm a professor at George Washington University, and I teach Dante and literature in general. I am so delighted. I thank you infinitely for having invited me to talk about Inferno 4 with you because being an avid bookworm, just a lover of all things legible. Inferno 4 gives us a chance to visit Dante's biblioteca, Dante's library, Dante's sort of mental library, um, and get a look at what he thinks is worthwhile reading, and it's the kinds of sources or raw material that he's using to dramatize this journey that he's about to take us on. So so he just got through the gates of hell. He just went
Exactly.
through ante inferno, and his guide has persuaded him that this is a journey that is willed by heaven. His guide, who resides in hell himself, right? Whose
Right.
abode is this first circle of hell. So
A
we're
very
entering the first
special
circle of hell.
place, right?
A very special
I've
place.
always thought about Limbo as,
Yes.
I mean, of course, it's the nicest place you can be if you have to leave down there, right?
Yes.
You can certainly have learned conversations with your sort of fellow
Yes.
citizens of Limbo.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Oh, imagine the amazing conversations you would have. No, I mean, you have every philosopher of note, right, during Dante's time, just sitting there available and waiting
Exactly.
to engage with you. It's really interesting to me how when he first enters into Limbo, the he's just come out of a situation where there's a lot of noise and crying and weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and there was the ferryman who was whipping people back and forth trying to get them in line, and suddenly it's dead quiet
Right.
and there's nothing but sighing, right?
Yeah. The
And
stillness of a library, isn't
the
it?
stillness of a library, exactly. And this sighing of like unmet hope, right? Unending yet unmet hope. He still doesn't quite know that that's what it is until Virgil explains it to him. And then he starts seeing the people who inhabit this place. Um, and it's interesting. In a few years ago, I don't remember when it was, in the 2000 somethings, the Vatican issued a pardon for all the babies in limbo, didn't it? Or something.
I think they did. I mean, I trust your knowledge of this kind of thing.
There was a headline, I believe it was in the New York Times, where the Vatican essentially abolished limbo because it was a way of freeing all the babies who were stuck down there. And
What about the Spiriti Magni?
now I don't think, here's the thing. I think they thought of the babies as completely unbesmirched and utterly innocent, where the spiriti mani dead lived their lives. So
Yeah,
they were in essence accountable. However, it essentially leaves them homeless to abolish limbo, doesn't it? Right?
yeah,
Where do they go?
exactly.
What happened is the Vatican destroys Dante's first seminal library. How is this a seminal library? Before we get into that, though, I just want to recall one of my favorite moments of realization when I first read Inferno 4 was, I remember as a child wondering what happened to all the righteous souls in the Old Testament, right?
Right.
And I know that I think it's a Gospel according to John that talks about the scene of the harrowing of hell, where after dying on the cross, Christ sort of storms hell, and retrieves all these souls who were waiting the incarnation and carries them off to heaven. And this is where Dante tells that story and essentially explains, I'm sorry, not Dante, but Virgilio tells that story and explains to Dante that once upon a time, this place contained everybody who was simply waiting in limbo, but the salvation, the incarnation, and the coming of the Christ meant that those who had been truly righteous in the right way were rescued and taken away. And the people who were left behind essentially didn't have the bona fides to go along with him. So for me as a child, that was a really powerful moment. I began paying really close attention to Dante at that point because he was essentially addressing a question that I'd had for a really long time as a Sunday school student, but no one had ever responded to. And this is just the beginning, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think you touched upon a very important aspect here, which is also the one of sort of thinking through time here, right? Because of course, most of these people, I would say basically all of them lived before Christ, right? And so they belong into these prehistory, right? For Dante in a way. And yet they are so significant, not only to Dante as a man, but also to Dante as the representative of, Christian culture in the Middle Ages, right? And I think the sort of combination of these two questions, right? That which you were asking about what happens to the writers from the Old Testament, or even to the virtuous people who lived before Christ, and how to tackle these two different chronologies. I think these two questions are intertwined, and Canto 4 really sort of raises them in a very powerful way.
It really does. It really does. You know what's delightful about the Commedia? Here we are going canto by canto, and the tradition of lectura dantis tends to go canto by canto. And yet this really important question, it keeps coming up throughout the journey until all the way in Paradiso 19, when the souls in heaven, the heaven of justice, actually take the words out of Dante's mouth and ask it straight up. So what happens to the righteous souls who were not baptized and never heard the story of Christ? What do you do with that part of the story, right? But that's another issue. And I think for anyone who's interested, Akash Kumar had a great conversation in this series with someone about that. So that would be a really good, episode.
Intertextual connection.
Exactly.
Canto per canto series.
Exactly. So moving on, as they're moving along and Dante begins to notice that this area it looks like a walled castle, right? In fact, it's concentrically walled. There's 7 walls. And there's 7, he has to cross 7 bridges or 7 moats or 7 gates or something, right? So each, every gate that he crosses brings him closer and closer to the center. And at that center, this is where he meets the most noble spirits proper, right? Legends of antiquity, legends of old Roman and Greek history, and not just the legends themselves, but even those people who set pen to paper to write about them. And this is where I really get that sense of library. Indeed. Because all the names that he's mentioning of the people that he's meeting are essentially the texts through which he learned all of this mythology, all of this philosophy, all of essentially the liberal arts that inform his intellect, right? All the things that he brings to bear to write this poem.
This is really Dante's encyclopedia in a way, right? And not only Dante's, right? Which is, of course, also extremely important. And I believe that we are going to sort of focus on 2 bunches of people in particular in our chat, right? Which deserve special attention. Even if something which I would like to stress before we get into our discussions of those specific kinds of people. What is particularly fascinating, or it's been fascinating to me when I, sort of began to think through this canto many, many years ago, is the fact that we don't really have distinctions of ontology, so to speak, right? Because of course we have, as you were saying, characters from history, characters from literature, philosophy, poetry, but we also have representatives of ancient history and mythology, right? So it's really an sort of encyclopedia of virtuous human beings who, no matter their belonging into a specific context, have done something, I would say, for humanity more broadly, right? Men and women, and this idea of sort of, to be anachronistic, cosmopolitanism is also fascinating. Something which I think keeps raising questions as modern lettori of the Divina.
Yes, I absolutely second that. And I would even go further and say that while the word or the concept, the way we think about it today, cosmopolitan, might seem anachronistic, this is exactly what the commedia is. It draws from everywhere and everything and every time and places. I think the term people love to use in Dante studies is like a synchronicity, right? So the synchronicity across time, across genres, across disciplines of sources, of texts. Before we started this conversation, you and I were talking about, we're playing this sort of intellectual experiment where we're imagining our own inner libraries as being themselves bodies in conversation with one another, right? The idea that every book that you've ever read that is present in your mind can enter into dialologue with every other book that you've ever read, right? And they don't
to some
have to
extent,
agree.
and sorry to interrupt, but to some
Yes.
extent, even those books which you haven't read,
Yes, because they're echoing things that are suggested to you, right?
Exactly.
Which, if your curiosity is piqued enough, then you might go searching for them, right?
Yeah.
It's really quite remarkable. So on that note, then one of the group of metonymic texts, right? Sort of library materials that Dante gets in contact with, obviously. Virgilio is the most important one, right? When he had first met Virgilio earlier on, he recognized him immediately because of what Virgilio wrote, right? The story of the son of Anchises, who came from Troy once Ilion was burnt down. And it is, those clues allow him to identify him. Ah, tu sei Virgilio, quella fonte che spandi di parlarsi largo fiume, valemi il lungo studio, il grande amore che mi ha fatto cercare il tuo volume. So it's Virgilio's volume that he anchors upon. And this, to me, I'm reading this and I'm suddenly realizing Dante is telling us that we're about to embark on a journey where the text, the volume of Virgil's work, is going to be speaking through him. And who else does he meet? What's really fascinating in this, once they've entered the center, there's a beautiful episode where Virgilio, who had been called from here by Beatrice, is now leading Dante through this very same section. He had told Dante, this is where I belong. This is where I'm going to come back once I deliver you. And a voice out in the crowd says, onorate altissimo poeta, l'ombra sua torna. Like, praise the highest poet, his shade returns, right? Yeah. They've recognized him. It's like there's such camaraderie to that greeting, It'd be like if you and I saw each other across a crowded room, we're like, hey, Eugenio! Exactly. Exactly. And Virgil, what I love about the way Virgilio reacts to that is he responds to them, and he's very sort of modest about, oh yes, when they praise me this way, they're essentially, paying honor to themselves. But he tells Dante, hold on a second, I'll be right back. And he separates and leaves Dante behind, sort of just standing there twiddling his thumbs, right? While he goes to talk to none other than Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan. Homer, who is the at least characterized here as the eagle of all poetic tradition out of which Dante comes. Homer, who later on will be described as the one who was breastfed by the muses, like directly breastfed by the muses. So Homer represents the apogee of the poetic tradition that Dante is coming out of. And then Ovid, Horace, and Lucan, they're contemporaries of Virgil, and they also represent poetic excellence of the time out of which Virgil came, right? So this is his posse. This is Virgil's posse. They call him over. He goes over to them, and poor Dante Pilgrim, who's just been following Virgil, asking questions, unsure of himself, is simply waiting. And the way Dante describes it is so beautiful. I want to read a little bit of the English, and then I'll go into the Italian, because I want to make sure that everyone can follow. So, so once they've spoken to each other, there I saw assembled the fair school of the Lord of loftiest song, Homer, soaring like an eagle far above the rest. After they conversed a while, they turned to me with signs of greeting, and my master smiled at this. And then they showed me greater honor still, for they made me one of their company, so that I became the sixth amidst such wisdom. Okay? So, così vidi adunar la bella scuola di quel signor dell'altissimo canto che sovra gli altri come aquila vola. Da che ben ragionato insieme alquanto volsersi a me con salutevol ceno, e il mio maestro sorrise di tanto. E più d'onore ancora, assai mi feno, che sì mi fecer da loro, della loro schiera, sorry, che sì mi fecer della loro schiera, sì ch'io fui sesto tra cotanto seno. What is fascinating to me about this passage is that traditionally, and almost unanimously, the way this is read tends to be generally very, very critical of Dante the poet, right?
Yeah.
The idea being that he's being this sort of self-aggrandizing person who dares, who has the temerity to insert himself
exactly in this lineage,
in the company of these great grand names of the Greco-Roman literary tradition. He's saying that he was the sixth among them. How dare he? And he's just a contemporary vernacular poet. He's writing in the lingua vulgare. How could he? It's so fascinating to see how upset people get about this, or how it becomes for them a lot of ammunition to then later sort of cut Dante down to size. You're not as great as you believe yourself to be. But I have a different conception of this. Just as you and I earlier were talking about how amazing it is when you recognize a friend from across, the room, and you're like, hey, Eugenio, and you're like, hey, Adoyo, what's up, right? The way I read this is, imagine a mentor who brings you to meet his colleagues or her colleagues. You're a student. You're an acolyte. You're just beginning, right?
Yeah.
These are the people whose texts you read and study and learn from. They are on a pedestal, right?
Yeah.
And when you first encounter them, you're sitting beside, not good, just told you, hold on a second. They talk amongst themselves, and then it is they who turn to you and welcome you amongst them. Have you ever experienced that, Eugenio? When somebody that you admired offered you a chair to sit down amongst them at the table, or invited you to give a talk, or asked you a question during a colloquium, right? And said, Eugenio, what do you think? What do you believe? the way I read this is a form of Dante paying homage to the magnanimity of these grand poetic voices who are available for the edification of whomever wishes to partake.
As long as you're there to listen to them.
As long as they're there to listen to them. So if you want to learn from Homer, from Virgil, from Lucan, from Horace, from anybody, from Aristotle, from Socrates, from whomever you wish to learn from, right? The intellectual generosity of a true mentor does not place conditions on you learning. All they do is welcome you. And I think that this is a really, really beautiful homage in the context of sort of recognizing his sources, his teachers, his mentors, his inspiration, because he's essentially letting us know that he's not simply appropriating their work. They created it and offered it freely for his free taking if he so wished. And this is how I read this.
But that's a very beautiful way to put it. And I really like it because, of course, it sort of stresses the idea of a conversation, of an active exchange. It makes me think about what Machiavelli writes about his own dialogue with the ancients in the famous letter to Vettori, right? The idea of being able to listen to them and let them talk to you. What is interesting here is that the encounter with the poets does take a sort of dialogical shape, because in a way they do interact with him. And of course, that's because Virgil is there. With the other group of people whom I wanted to talk about, this doesn't really happen. What's interesting is that poetry is loud in a way. Poetry is eloquent. Poetry, ancient poetry, talks to Dante in Limbo, whereas the philosophers, that's the other group of people, are there, but they don't really talk. They're not chatty people, right? And Aristotle doesn't even need to be named, right? This is a very famous passage, and I would like to read it. So just, a few terzine after the ones which you read, Adoyo, we have the encounter with the philosopher. Poi, chinalzi un poco più le ciglia, vidi il maestro di color che sanno, the master of those who know, seder tra filosofica famiglia. So we had the bella scuola of poetry, and then we have the philosophical family, right? We are family, as the saying goes. And in this case, the family is Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and all the others. But I think it is interesting to look at these two ways of interacting with the past. These, as you were describing, very intimate and also personal dialogue with the poets, and then this more detached and yet super respectful way of looking at Aristotle and the philosophical family. It makes me think that in a way, there's here maybe an implicit discourse about the different ways in which a reader digests poetry versus philosophy, right? Of course, you do have a dialogue with philosophers as well, but it's often either a silent dialogue because you read them, or even if it's a dialogical interaction, for instance, within a dispute, it's always very academic and philosophically constructed. Whereas in the case of poetry, the voice of the poets seems to matter significantly. And I like these, two different kinds of conversations with the past, poetry and philosophy. What do you think about this possible way of comparing the families?
I love it. I love the idea. I love how you bring out the difference in the dynamic between them, like in the interactive dynamic between them. The idea that with the poets, there's a sort of a paternal filial relationship with the poets, whereas there seems to be a more removed sort of ex cathedra relationship with the philosophers. And it's curious because, again, in the spirit of intertextual and internal memory of the poem, you find that the way the commedia, the poem itself, right, deals with other poets continues to be this very intimate and personal dialogic interaction, whereas the way it deals with philosophy, whether it is to lean on philosophy for its foundational ideas or to challenge the shortcomings of philosophy, it's always in a much more strict sort of pedagogical fashion. So this is a great observation to make.
And it's always, I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of Aristotle, which is a good friend of mine, but it's always, even in the case of Dante, reading, right? Of course, we know that, he read the physics, he read the ethics. These are certainly part of Dante's bibliography, right? But what we don't really hear is the voice of the philosophers, right? I mean, we do hear the voice of the poets.
Yes.
And I don't know whether this kind of, makes sense to you, but...
It does. And it makes me think of the fact that what's really interesting about the voice of Aristotle is that it always comes filtered through someone else's voice, right?
Sure.
For example, in Inferno 11, the physics and the ethics comes filtered through the voice of Virgilio. Virgilio says, if you remember your physics and your etica, this is what it says after so many pages. In Paradiso, or even in I believe in Purgatorio, this happens as well. But especially in Paradiso, when Beatrice is correcting Aristotle, right? It is through Beatrice's voice that we hear the text of Aristotle. And going back to what we were saying earlier in our thought experiment, like looking at these anthropomorphic figures as bodies of text that are in dialogue with each other inside Dante's intellectual universe, then in a sense, we have the poem sort of delivering Aristotle to us, but through the lens of a Virgilian worldview, right? Yeah. So just as, for example, we get Ulysses delivered through a Virgilian worldview, and so by the time we get to Beatrice talking about Aristotle, right, we know that Beatrice is Dante's poetic creation, right? And so this is the poet Dante who gets to now, discourse on Virgilio personally, but through the spokes voice of this poetic creation of his. It's really, really quite beautiful. It's it really makes me appreciate what one of the most wonderful literary scholars of the past century said about Dante being at the threshold of a millennium of literature. So he takes all of the millennium before him, puts it, sort of delivers it to us. And all of the millennium following, we haven't finished the millennium yet. We're still at 700 years at this point. All the millennium following it has the opportunity to mine all of what Dante has provided for us. So for me, at least, Dante makes famous not just the contemporaries who might have disappeared, right, into silence, were they not included in the Commedia, but he makes present and immediate for me these philosophies and all of these texts, these poetries that might otherwise have been just like dispersed and disconnected. They're all part of a comprehensive universe.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that this image, which you just sort of outlined so beautifully, is in a way what we should think about when we talk about the mechanisms of reception, right?
Yes.
That's how reception works. And of course, this would bring us into another conversation. I'm afraid that we are running out of time. But of course, stay tuned for another chat. And it was really, really delightful to be talking to you, Adoyo, about Canto 4.
It really was. This is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Eugenio. Delightful.
Sure. Thank you very much.
And grazie, Dante. I have to say, Dante, thank you so much for inviting us to sort of participate in your universe of just like thought and beauty and all of that. Because he essentially, con amichevol ceno, sort of invites us.
He's the one who
invites. Exactly. Thank you, Eugenio.
Thank you.
Ci vediamo. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.